My name is Nicole Woodstock, and I'm here to discuss the letter that George Washington wrote to Alexander Hamilton on March 4th, 1783. The time period of 1775 to 1783 was a period of discomfort that would inevitably determine the existence of the United States. The specific year of 1783 brought America to a period of great distress. The Revolutionary War was at its final stretch, and the Continental Congress and the newly forming United States still were having great trouble in the attempt to finance the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War was at an all-time high of critical decisions that would determine the fate of the newly forming country. Throughout the course of the war, the Continental Army was trekking through a period of great suffering and deeply wanted to see some good fortune in replace of their many sufferings. The Continental Congress was facing a major issue of maintaining financial stability, and as a result of this, there was an issue of carrying the Revolutionary War forward. The ability to provide new resources and supplies to the army became almost impossible, and as a result, the conditions within the army increasingly became worse and worse. The year of 1775, there was an approximate amount of at most $12 million in gold in the colonies, which was not enough to cover current transactions, let alone carry on a major war. The period of financial stability was at an all-time low. Moreover, the British did not ease the financial decline at any cost. The British Navy established a force of tight blockades that existed on every American port. This was much greater income losses because America's urban centers were damaged by British naval attacks, and the British seized any American ship whose captain tried to take them to sea. This move made it almost impossible to work trade because it cut off almost all imports and exports. The Continental Congress was frantically trying to find solutions that would create some flow of income to support the war and the developing country. One specific solution was to rely on volunteer support from militiamen, creating the Continental Army, and the country would thrive off of donations from citizens. The way this was put into use almost immediately was to delay the actual payments to the soldiers and instead to pay the soldiers and suppliers in a form of depreciated currency, ensuring a promise of these actual payments after the war ends. This depreciated currency led the country full speed into a period of rampant inflation, where paper money deteriorated to about a face value of 1/40th of its original value, which further troubled the ability to compensate the Army's war efforts. In response to high inflation, finally the Continental Congress turned to foreign countries, France and Holland specifically, and the cash-strapped Continental Congress ended up accepting loans from both. General George Washington pointed out in a letter to Hamilton that, a loan from Holland, we should be able to rub along. General George Washington was very concerned about how long he would be able to push his troops, despite the unfortunate circumstances being endured, until they would call quits. The demands of the army continued to grow day by day due to the want of compensation for their efforts. Washington, who understood the crucial need for a decision that would mark an end to the army's suffering at the time, wrote out to specific people to whom he thought would best help the situation that he was in. One person that he approached was Alexander Hamilton. Because Hamilton was General George Washington's assistant, General Washington decided to approach him the most. Washington and Hamilton both realized that our finances was in so deplorable a state at this time. Hamilton was well aware that Congress could never meet the expectations to conduct the war properly, so long as it was dependent on the state funding. Congress and the states alone seemed not much help in efforts to ease the financial situation because, in the words of General George Washington, the sufferings of a complaining army on one hand, and the inability of Congress and tardiness of the states on the other, are the forebodings of evil and may be productive of events which are more to be deprecated than prevented. In accordance to Washington, he stressed that Congress and the states were completely unproductive under the task that was at hand, and rather was more productive on tasks that are trivial and hurtful to their current problem at the time. So therefore, Washington and Hamilton agreed on the fact that the financial war of their time would need more assistance than just leaving the bodies of Congress and the states to deal with it alone. The problem was that Hamilton and Washington were not quite sure how to do this. Hamilton was well aware that the ability to tax the citizens was not another option they could put into action because Congress lacked the ability to tax, being that this drove the revolution in the first place. This unfortunately brought them back to just continuing on with the previous ideas that were weakening the Army's morale and increasing their families' hardships. Hamilton and Washington frequently conversed on how the Army's morale was declining in extreme amounts. In a letter to General George Washington from Alexander Hamilton, Hamilton pointed out that if the war continues, it would seem that the Army must in June subsist itself to defend the country. If peace should take place, it will assist itself to procure justice to itself. It appears to be a prevailing opinion in the Army that this disposition to recompense their services will cease with the necessity for them, and that if they once lay down their arms, they will part with the means of obtaining justice. Hamilton, within saying this extreme prediction, pointed out to Washington that if the compensation for the Army continued to hold off even further, eventually the Army would lose enough morale to discourage them from fighting for their and their country's independence any longer. Hamilton also realizes that since the Army is suffering at an intense level, it would be hard to keep them at moderation. Hamilton meant that it would be hard to keep the Army at bay and keep them level-headed because he predicted that eventually not one would want to fight without reward for this extended period of time. Eventually, the Army would subdue their war effort and until proper pay and supplies were rewarded to them accordingly. Unfortunately, it was difficult to ensure the Army of future proper pay considering the financial circumstances the country was undergoing at that moment, and because all the Continental Army wanted was to be paid or not fight. Due to this, Hamilton also pointed out that the Army will eventually misbehave and portray bad conduct that would correspond with their lack of duties being performed in response to the terrible conditions during the war. In response to the previous letter that Hamilton wrote to Washington, Washington wrote, "This and pursuing the suggestions of your letter, in which I am happy to find coincides with my own practice for several months past, and which was the means of directing the business of the Army into the channel it is now, leaves me under no great apprehension of its exceeding the bounds of reason and moderation, notwithstanding the prevailing sentiment in the Army is that the prospect of compensation for past services will terminate with the war." In this excerpt of the letter, Washington pointed out an inevitable end to the Army where that if their compensations and demands are not met soon, eventually their wants of compensation will end with the revolution. If they stop fighting due to their demands not being met, the revolution would end along with their desires as well. Eventually, even to have gone through the extremely difficult Revolutionary War times, the Continental Army secured a substantial win under their belt that gave the United States a chance to form itself into what it is today. Through General George Washington's persistence, the Army carried out through hard times, even in need of supplies and under horrible conditions. Once the war ended, the Continental Congress shifted all their focus on trying to repay back all the war debts and to fix the United States debt to the full extent in which it was created. The Congress needed to repay the wealthy landowners for buying bonds and the various foreign countries which helped them through financial aid. The bonds ended up being redeemed in the year 1791 at face value. However, the scheme ended up raising very little money due to the fact that Americans had extremely little specie, and to add, many of the rich merchants were unfortunately supporters of the crown. They achieved reducing the debt further under the U.S. Constitution of 1789, which allowed the new federal government to enjoy the increased authority to manage U.S. finances and to raise revenues through introduced taxation. The responsibility for managing these debts fell into the hands of the newly elected Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Through cautious decisions, Hamilton ended up placing U.S. finances on a firmer ground, which allowed for the U.S. government to negotiate new loans at lower interest rates. Moreover, the United States began to take on the task of making regular payments to assist in the decrease of its French debts, which started in the year 1790. Finally, this also provided an emergency advance to assist the French in addressing the 1791 slave revolt that began the Haitian Revolution to help ease the Revolutionary War debts. Bam!